Gold was confiscated once, not by accident, not by chaos, but because the system could no longer tolerate an exit. At the time, it was described as temporary, necessary, unavoidable. Today, the world is far more indebted, far more leveraged, and far more dependent on confidence than it was back then. Yet gold still exists outside the system. It still ignores policy, and it still offers something governments cannot print. The question is no longer whether gold confiscation was a historical anomaly. The question is whether a system built entirely on belief can tolerate an asset that does not require belief at all. Gold confiscation is often remembered as an unthinkable act, a historical anomaly driven by desperation. In reality, it was framed as necessity, justified by stability, and executed with remarkable public compliance. Understanding why it happened once is essential to understanding why it is no longer unthinkable today. In the early years of the Great Depression, the United States faced a systemic crisis that threatened the foundations of its monetary system. Bank failures were widespread. Credit collapsed. Confidence evaporated. The gold standard, which had once anchored trust in the currency, became a constraint rather than a safeguard. Under the gold standard, money supply was directly tied to gold reserves. As panic spread, citizens and institutions began hoarding gold. This behavior was rational. Gold represented certainty in an environment where banks failed and paper claims evaporated. But from the perspective of the state, it was catastrophic. Hoarding removed gold from circulation. As gold left the banking system, the ability to expand credit vanished. Deflation intensified. Prices collapsed. Debts became heavier in real terms. The economy entered a downward spiral that policy could not arrest as long as gold remained privately controlled. The government faced a dilemma. Either maintain respect for private gold ownership and accept prolonged collapse, or intervene decisively to restore control over monetary conditions. The choice was framed not as confiscation, but as stabilization. When the executive order was issued in the early 1930s, it was not presented as an attack on property rights. It was presented as an emergency measure to protect the nation. Citizens were required to surrender monetary gold in exchange for paper currency at a fixed price. Non-compliance was criminalized. Compliance was widespread. The public reaction is often misunderstood. There was resistance, but it was limited. Most citizens complied because the alternative was framed as national failure. Gold ownership was portrayed as selfish hoarding. Surrender was framed as civic duty. Economic messaging was critical. The government argued that private gold ownership undermined recovery. By concentrating gold in public hands, the state could expand money supply, reflate prices, and stabilize employment. This argument resonated in an environment of mass unemployment and hardship. The results appeared to validate the approach. After consolidation of gold reserves, the government devalued the currency relative to gold. This effectively transferred wealth from private holders to the state. It also eased debt burdens and allowed monetary expansion. Recovery followed, unevenly but visibly. From a systemic perspective, gold confiscation was not an aberration. It was a logical response to a system where private control of hard money conflicted with state objectives. Gold represented an escape from policy. In crisis, escape is intolerable. This pattern is not unique to one country. Throughout history, when monetary systems come under extreme stress, governments assert control over assets that threaten policy effectiveness. Gold has always been one of those assets. What is crucial is not the legality of the action, but its framing. Confiscation succeeded because it was normalized as emergency governance. It was temporary. It was necessary. It was for the greater good. Equally important is what followed. After confiscation, gold ownership remained restricted for decades. The policy did not reverse quickly. What began as an emergency measure became structural. This reveals an important truth. Once the state asserts control over gold in crisis, it rarely relinquishes that control easily. The precedent becomes part of institutional memory. Modern observers often assume that such actions belong to a different era, a time of simpler systems and crude tools. That assumption is dangerous. The core logic has not changed. Only the mechanisms have. Then, gold threatened the gold standard. Today, gold threatens fiat credibility. The system is different, but the conflict is familiar. Gold functions outside the control of monetary authorities. It does not yield. It does not require trust in institutions. It cannot be printed. In periods of stability, this independence is tolerated. In periods of stress, it becomes a problem. The lesson of the 1930s is not that governments will seize gold casually. It is that when the system demands control, principles adapt quickly. Legal frameworks bend, narratives shift, compliance follows. Gold confiscation did not require chaos in the streets. It required fear, legitimacy, and a convincing story about necessity. Those ingredients exist in every major crisis. What makes this history relevant today is not nostalgia, but structure. The global economy now carries unprecedented debt burdens. Monetary policy operates at the edge of credibility. Confidence matters more than reserves. In such an environment, assets that allow private actors to opt out of the system attract attention. Gold is foremost among them. History does not repeat loudly. It repeats quietly, through incentives and constraints rather than announcements. Gold confiscation was once considered unthinkable, until it wasn't. And the conditions that made it acceptable then were not unique. They were systemic. Understanding that reality is the first step toward understanding why the question today is no longer whether such measures could happen again, but under what conditions they become politically and economically rational. Because when systems face existential pressure, what was once unimaginable becomes policy. Gold remains dangerous to governments, not because it is volatile, speculative, or scarce, but because it exists outside the chain of permission. It is one of the few financial assets that does not rely on the credibility of institutions to function as money. That independence is precisely what makes it intolerable during periods of systemic stress. Modern monetary systems are built on confidence rather than convertibility. Fiat currency has value because citizens believe the issuing authority can manage stability. That belief is reinforced through taxation, regulation, and the absence of viable alternatives. Gold undermines this structure by offering an exit that does not require approval. In stable periods, this exit is largely symbolic. Gold ownership is tolerated because few people feel compelled to abandon the system. But tolerance is conditional. It depends on confidence remaining intact. When confidence weakens, gold transforms from a passive asset into a competing monetary reference. Governments understand this dynamic. Gold does not compete with fiat currencies on convenience. It competes on trust. And trust is the foundation of monetary authority. Unlike bonds, gold cannot be defaulted on. Unlike bank deposits, it cannot be frozen electronically. Unlike equities, it does not depend on corporate performance. It does not yield, but it also does not promise. Its value is derived from what it does not require. This absence of dependency creates a problem for policymakers. Monetary policy functions by influencing behavior. Interest rates, liquidity provision, and credit conditions guide economic activity. Gold does not respond to these levers. When capital flows into gold, it signals a refusal to participate in policy transmission. In other words, gold represents a breakdown in control. This is why governments rarely oppose gold openly in normal times, but monitor it closely. High and sustained demand for gold is interpreted not as an investment preference, but as a loss of confidence signal. When gold accumulation accelerates, it suggests that policy credibility is weakening. The global financial system has evolved dramatically since the last major gold confiscation, but the underlying vulnerability has intensified. Debt levels have expanded far beyond historical norms. Monetary policy operates with narrower margins. Fiscal credibility depends heavily on continuous refinancing. In such an environment, assets that allow capital to escape policy frameworks become strategically sensitive. Gold functions as a private reserve system. When households, institutions, or foreign actors accumulate gold, they effectively withdraw trust from fiat mechanisms. This withdrawal may be gradual, but its implications are profound. Historically, governments have tolerated this behavior only when it remains marginal. When gold ownership becomes widespread, it threatens the state's ability to manage inflation, service debt, and stabilize markets. The danger is not that gold replaces currency overnight. The danger is that it weakens the monopoly of reference. When citizens begin pricing security in gold rather than currency, policy loses psychological effectiveness. This effect is amplified in modern economies where financial assets dominate household wealth. When inflation erodes purchasing power and interest rates fail to compensate, gold becomes a visible alternative. Its appeal is not return, but preservation. Central banks are acutely aware of this. Despite public narratives downplaying gold's role, central banks continue to hold significant reserves. This is not tradition, it is insurance. Gold remains the asset of last resort when confidence collapses. This duality reveals the contradiction. States dismiss gold's relevance publicly while relying on it privately. They tolerate ownership as long as it does not challenge policy dominance. When private gold accumulation grows too large, tolerance erodes. Regulation begins to tighten subtly. Reporting requirements expand. Transaction thresholds are lowered. Tax treatment becomes less favorable. The goal is not immediate seizure, but visibility and friction. Visibility is power. Once ownership is visible, control becomes possible. This pattern is observable globally. Countries facing currency instability or fiscal stress consistently introduce measures that constrain physical gold markets. These measures are framed as anti-money laundering, consumer protection, or market transparency. Their effect is control. Gold threatens governments not because it is illegal, but because it is autonomous. Autonomy is acceptable only when it is harmless. In crisis, autonomy becomes subversion. The modern financial system depends on participation. Debt markets require buyers. Currency systems require users. Banking systems require deposits. Gold offers a way to opt out without protest. Governments can tolerate dissent. They struggle to tolerate exit. This is the critical distinction. Gold does not oppose the system, it ignores it. Ignoring authority is often more dangerous than challenging it. In periods of rising debt, persistent inflation, or geopolitical stress, this danger increases. The more fragile the system becomes, the less tolerance exists for parallel stores of value. Gold therefore occupies a paradoxical position. It is legal, it is traditional, it is widely recognized, yet it is perpetually suspect. The lesson from history is not that governments hate gold, it is that governments hate losing monetary narrative control. Gold breaks that narrative by existing independently of promises. As global systems grow more indebted and less flexible, assets that escape policy frameworks become more politically sensitive. Gold sits at the center of that sensitivity. This is why the question is not whether gold is allowed, but under what conditions it stops being tolerated. Because when monetary authority depends entirely on belief, anything that allows belief to exit quietly becomes a threat. And gold has always offered that exit. Gold remains dangerous to governments not because it is volatile, speculative, or scarce, but because it exists outside the chain of permission. It is one of the few financial assets that does not rely on the credibility of institutions to function as money. That independence is precisely what makes it intolerable during periods of systemic stress. Modern monetary systems are built on confidence rather than convertibility. Fiat currency has value because citizens believe the issuing authority can manage stability. That belief is reinforced through taxation, regulation, and the absence of viable alternatives. Gold undermines this structure by offering an exit that does not require approval. In stable periods, this exit is largely symbolic. Gold ownership is tolerated because few people feel compelled to abandon the system. But tolerance is conditional. It depends on confidence remaining intact. When confidence weakens, gold transforms from a passive asset into a competing monetary reference. Governments understand this dynamic. Gold does not compete with fiat currencies on convenience. It competes on trust. And trust is the foundation of monetary authority. Unlike bonds, gold cannot be defaulted on. Unlike bank deposits, it cannot be frozen electronically. Unlike equities, it does not depend on corporate performance. It does not yield, but it also does not promise. Its value is derived from what it does not require. This absence of dependency creates a problem for policymakers. Monetary policy functions by influencing behavior. Interest rates, liquidity provision, and credit conditions guide economic activity. Gold does not respond to these levers. When capital flows into gold, it signals a refusal to participate in policy transmission. In other words, gold represents a breakdown in control. This is why governments rarely oppose gold openly in normal times, but monitor it closely. High and sustained demand for gold is interpreted not as an investment preference, but as a loss of confidence signal. When gold accumulation accelerates, it suggests that policy credibility is weakening. The global financial system has evolved dramatically since the last major gold confiscation, but the underlying vulnerability has intensified. Debt levels have expanded far beyond historical norms. Monetary policy operates with narrower margins. Fiscal credibility depends heavily on continuous refinancing. In such an environment, assets that allow capital to escape policy frameworks become strategically sensitive. Gold functions as a private reserve system. When households, institutions, or foreign actors accumulate gold, they effectively withdraw trust from fiat mechanisms. This withdrawal may be gradual, but its implications are profound. Historically, governments have tolerated this behavior only when it remains marginal. When gold ownership becomes widespread, it threatens the state's ability to manage inflation, service debt, and stabilize markets. The danger is not that gold replaces currency overnight. The danger is that it weakens the monopoly of reference. When citizens begin pricing security in gold rather than currency, policy loses psychological effectiveness. This effect is amplified in modern economies where financial assets dominate household wealth. When inflation erodes purchasing power and interest rates fail to compensate, gold becomes a visible alternative. Its appeal is not return, but preservation. Central banks are acutely aware of this. Despite public narratives downplaying gold's role, central banks continue to hold significant reserves. This is not tradition, it is insurance. Gold remains the asset of last resort when confidence collapses. This duality reveals the contradiction. States dismiss gold's relevance publicly while relying on it privately. They tolerate ownership as long as it does not challenge policy dominance. When private gold accumulation grows too large, tolerance erodes. Regulation begins to tighten subtly. Reporting requirements expand. Transaction thresholds are lowered. Tax treatment becomes less favorable. The goal is not immediate seizure, but visibility and friction. Visibility is power. Once ownership is visible, control becomes possible. This pattern is observable globally. Countries facing currency instability or fiscal stress consistently introduce measures that constrain physical gold markets. These measures are framed as anti-money laundering, consumer protection, or market transparency. Their effect is control. Gold threatens governments not because it is illegal, but because it is autonomous. Autonomy is acceptable only when it is harmless. In crisis, autonomy becomes subversion. The modern financial system depends on participation. Debt markets require buyers. Currency systems require users. Banking systems require deposits. Gold offers a way to opt out without protest. Governments can tolerate dissent. They struggle to tolerate exit. This is the critical distinction. Gold does not oppose the system, it ignores it. Ignoring authority is often more dangerous than challenging it. In periods of rising debt, persistent inflation, or geopolitical stress, this danger increases. The more fragile the system becomes, the less tolerance exists for parallel stores of value. Gold therefore occupies a paradoxical position. It is legal, it is traditional, it is widely recognized, yet it is perpetually suspect. The lesson from history is not that governments hate gold, it is that governments hate losing monetary narrative control. Gold breaks that narrative by existing independently of promises. As global systems grow more indebted and less flexible, assets that escape policy frameworks become more politically sensitive. Gold sits at the center of that sensitivity. This is why the question is not whether gold is allowed, but under what conditions it stops being tolerated. Because when monetary authority depends entirely on belief, anything that allows belief to exit quietly becomes a threat. And gold has always offered that exit. The modern financial system presents itself as more sophisticated, more diversified, and more resilient than anything that existed in the past. Digital payments dominate daily life. Capital markets are deeper. Central banks possess tools unimaginable in earlier eras. From the outside, this appears to reduce the relevance of gold and eliminate the need for extreme measures. In reality, the opposite is true. What has changed since the last gold confiscation is not the underlying logic of power, but the fragility of the structure it supports. The global economy today is built on layers of leverage, promises, and coordination that depend almost entirely on confidence. That dependence magnifies the threat posed by assets that operate outside institutional control. In the early 20th century, gold constrained governments because it limited money creation. Today, gold threatens governments because it exposes the limits of trust. Fiat systems no longer promise convertibility. They promise stability. That promise must be constantly defended. The scale of modern debt makes this defense critical. Sovereign obligations have expanded to levels that cannot be reduced without severe disruption. Governments do not plan to repay debt. They plan to manage it indefinitely. This strategy requires uninterrupted confidence in currency and institutions. Gold undermines that confidence, not by competing on transaction efficiency, but by existing as a parallel reference. It allows individuals and institutions to store value without relying on policy credibility. In a system where credibility is the foundation, this independence is destabilizing. Modern financial markets amplify this effect. Capital moves faster. Information spreads instantly. Shifts in sentiment propagate globally within hours. What once took years now occurs in weeks. Early signals matter more than outcomes. Gold functions as one of those early signals. Rising demand does not indicate panic. It indicates doubt. Doubt spreads faster than panic and is far harder to reverse. This sensitivity explains why governments monitor gold closely, even when dismissing its relevance publicly. Gold price movements, physical demand trends, and reserve flows are treated as indicators of confidence stress. Recent global developments reinforce this dynamic. Persistent inflation pressures, despite aggressive monetary tightening, have weakened faith in traditional policy responses. Currency purchasing power has eroded unevenly. Real yields have remained constrained. These conditions push rational actors toward preservation assets. At the same time, geopolitical fragmentation has altered assumptions about property rights. Asset freezes, sanctions, and capital controls have demonstrated that legal ownership is conditional. What matters is jurisdiction, alignment, and compliance. These precedents change behavior. When individuals and institutions observe that bank deposits can be frozen and securities immobilized, they reassess risk. Gold's appeal increases not because it is superior, but because it is less exposed. Technology does not neutralize this appeal. It enhances it. Secure storage, global logistics, and market access make gold more portable and liquid than in the past. The barrier to exit has lowered. This is an uncomfortable reality for policymakers. The effectiveness of modern governance relies on participation. Monetary policy requires deposits. Fiscal policy requires taxable activity. Financial stability requires assets to remain within controlled channels. Gold represents leakage from those channels. Leakage does not need to be large to matter. It needs to be persistent. Even modest shifts into gold signal a willingness to disengage from policy frameworks. That willingness threatens narrative control. Modern states are acutely aware of this. Unlike past confiscations driven by emergency collapse, contemporary responses are anticipatory. The objective is not to seize assets during chaos, but to prevent large-scale exit before chaos emerges. This anticipatory posture changes the playbook. Measures are introduced gradually. Reporting requirements expand. Transaction scrutiny increases. Storage becomes regulated. Tax treatment discourages accumulation. Each step appears administrative, not coercive. The public narrative emphasizes safety, transparency, and consumer protection. The underlying objective is visibility. Visibility precedes control. This approach reflects lessons learned from history. Sudden confiscation damages legitimacy. Gradual normalization preserves it. Modern governance prefers the latter. The irony is that the more fragile the system becomes, the less tolerance exists for independent assets. The more governments rely on confidence, the more threatening alternatives appear. Gold therefore occupies a paradoxical position in the modern era. It is officially irrelevant, yet strategically sensitive. It is legal, yet closely watched. It is dismissed rhetorically, yet accumulated institutionally. This contradiction is not accidental. It reflects unresolved tension between autonomy and control. The modern financial system can function only if most participants remain within it. Gold provides a way out that does not require confrontation. That makes it uniquely destabilizing. The conditions that once justified gold confiscation have not disappeared. They have evolved. High debt, fragile confidence, geopolitical stress, and reliance on control define the current era. History does not repeat because leaders forget. It repeats because systems recreate the same incentives. When incentives align, actions follow. Gold confiscation does not require authoritarian intent. It requires systemic pressure. And the modern system is under more pressure, not less. What ultimately distinguishes the modern era from the past is not intent, but capability. Governments today possess an infrastructure of financial oversight and behavioral management that did not exist during previous periods of monetary stress. This infrastructure allows control to be exercised incrementally, quietly, and with minimal public resistance. In earlier eras, confiscation required visible force. Decrees were issued. Deadlines were announced. Non-compliance was punished overtly. The action was unmistakable. This visibility created political risk and long-lasting resentment. Modern systems learn from this experience. Today, control is exerted upstream rather than at the point of seizure. Ownership is shaped before it becomes problematic. Incentives are adjusted. Frictions are introduced. Choices are guided rather than forbidden. Financial surveillance plays a central role. Reporting thresholds, compliance requirements, and disclosure regimes transform private ownership into monitored ownership. Once assets are visible, they become governable. Governability reduces the need for confrontation. Gold is particularly affected by this shift. Physical ownership once relied on anonymity. Today, acquisition, storage, transport, and sale increasingly intersect with regulated entities. Each intersection creates data. Each data point increases visibility. Visibility changes behavior. When individuals know that ownership is observable, accumulation slows. When transactions are scrutinized, liquidity declines. When storage is regulated, accessibility diminishes. The asset remains legal, but less practical. This is not accidental. It is design. Taxation further reinforces control. Changes in capital gains treatment, transaction taxes, and reporting obligations alter incentives without banning ownership. Gold becomes less attractive relative to financial assets that align with policy goals. At the same time, governments expand narratives around financial security and illicit activity. Anti-money laundering frameworks, counterterrorism financing rules, and market integrity measures provide justification. These frameworks are broadly supported by the public, making resistance politically costly. Gold becomes associated not with stability, but with suspicion. This reframing matters. Assets framed as risky or antisocial lose social legitimacy even if they remain legal. Another critical development is the rise of digital monetary alternatives controlled by the state. Central bank-issued digital currencies, real-time payment systems, and programmable money expand the reach of monetary policy. Participation becomes easier, faster, and more convenient. As convenience increases, tolerance for non-participation decreases. Assets outside the system appear increasingly abnormal. Gold's independence becomes more conspicuous. In this environment, confiscation no longer needs to be immediate or universal. It can be selective, targeted, and conditional. Restrictions can be applied during emergencies, crises, or policy transitions, then normalized. Emergency powers play a crucial role. Modern legal frameworks grant governments broad authority during financial or national security crises. These powers are intentionally vague. Flexibility is prioritized over clarity. Once activated, emergency measures often persist. Temporary controls become semi-permanent. Precedents accumulate. Each intervention lowers the threshold for the next. This pattern is observable across multiple jurisdictions. Capital controls introduced as temporary safeguards remain in place for decades. Restrictions justified by crisis become structural features of the system. Gold is not immune to this logic. When stress rises, restrictions on movement, trade, or ownership can be framed as necessary safeguards. The language avoids confiscation. The effect is similar. Importantly, modern governments no longer need public consensus to act. They need compliance from financial intermediaries. Banks, custodians, exchanges, and logistics providers serve as enforcement nodes. Once intermediaries comply, individual resistance becomes irrelevant. This decentralization of enforcement reduces political risk. Responsibility is diffused. No single action appears decisive. The system adjusts quietly. The most dangerous aspect of this evolution is normalization. Each measure appears reasonable. Each step is justified. The cumulative effect is profound, but difficult to contest. History's lesson is not that confiscation happens suddenly. It is that it becomes acceptable gradually. Modern systems excel at gradualism. Gold's role in this environment is therefore precarious. It remains valuable precisely because it resists control. That resistance makes it a target. The question is no longer whether governments could restrict gold ownership. The question is whether they could do so without calling it confiscation. The answer is yes. Through regulation, taxation, surveillance, and narrative control, ownership can be transformed into permission. Permission can be revoked quietly. This does not require malicious intent. It requires systemic pressure and institutional incentives. When debt burdens rise, when inflation erodes trust, And when geopolitical stress demands control, independent assets become inconvenient. Gold's independence is its strength for holders. It is its weakness within systems built on coordination. The modern playbook does not repeat history verbatim, it refines it. Confiscation no longer arrives with announcements. It arrives with frameworks, and by the time it is recognized as such, it has already become normal. That is why gold confiscation is no longer unthinkable. Not because governments desire it, but because the system now knows how to achieve the same outcome without ever using the word. And history, when repeated quietly, is hardest to resist. Modern confiscation does not announce itself as confiscation. It presents itself as governance. This is the most important shift since the last time gold was formally seized. Power no longer needs to confront ownership directly. It reshapes the environment in which ownership exists until the outcome becomes unavoidable. The classical image of confiscation assumes force, deadlines, and visible coercion. That image is outdated. Modern states operate through systems rather than commands. They influence behavior by redesigning incentives, compliance costs, and legal exposure. What changes is not the right to own, but the practicality of ownership. Gold sits at the center of this evolution. The modern confiscation playbook begins with normalization. Gold ownership is never attacked directly. Instead, it is reframed. The narrative shifts from protection and stability toward risk and regulation. Gold becomes associated with tax evasion, illicit finance, and systemic opacity. These associations do not need to be proven. They need only to be repeated. Once reframing is established, regulation follows naturally. Reporting thresholds are introduced or lowered. Transactions that were once routine become reportable events. Storage providers face licensing requirements. Transport is monitored. Each rule appears technical. Collectively, they alter behavior. The purpose of regulation is not to prohibit, but to surface. Visibility transforms private ownership into administrated ownership. Once an asset is visible, it becomes measurable. Once measurable, it becomes manageable. Management is the precursor to control. Tax policy then reshapes incentives. Capital gains treatment changes. Holding periods are penalized. Transaction costs rise. Gold becomes less attractive relative to assets aligned with policy objectives. Ownership remains legal, but inefficient. Efficiency matters. Most people respond to friction long before they respond to force. When holding gold becomes cumbersome, expensive, or legally complex, participation declines organically. This is governance through attrition. At the same time, financial intermediaries are integrated into enforcement. Banks, custodians, vault operators, brokers, and logistics firms are required to comply with expanding rules. Compliance responsibility shifts away from the individual and onto institutions. Institutions comply because non-compliance threatens their existence. Once intermediaries comply, enforcement becomes automatic. No mass action is required. No confrontation occurs. The system adjusts quietly. Emergency powers represent the next layer. Modern legal frameworks grant governments broad authority during financial instability, national security threats, or systemic crises. These powers are intentionally broad. They prioritize discretion over precision. Emergency measures rarely appear extreme when introduced. They are framed as temporary safeguards. History shows that temporary measures often persist. The justification evolves. The restriction remains. Gold is particularly vulnerable during these periods. Movement restrictions, export controls, transaction freezes, or compulsory disclosures can be justified as stability measures. Each action appears defensive. The cumulative effect is control. The most effective aspect of the modern playbook is sequencing. Measures are introduced incrementally. No single step triggers widespread opposition. Resistance dissipates because the change is never concentrated. This incrementalism distinguishes modern systems from their predecessors. Where earlier governments relied on decisive action, modern states rely on gradual alignment. Alignment produces compliance without confrontation. Another critical element is asymmetry. Institutional ownership of gold is treated differently from private ownership. Central banks accumulate gold quietly while discouraging private accumulation. This creates a clear signal about acceptable ownership. The message is implicit but powerful. Gold is valuable in official hands. It is destabilizing in private hands. This asymmetry reinforces legitimacy. When governments hold gold, they claim prudence. When individuals hold gold, suspicion arises. The same asset is framed differently depending on the holder. Modern communication amplifies this effect. Media narratives emphasize volatility, environmental impact, and regulatory risk. Gold ownership is portrayed as archaic or speculative. Younger generations are encouraged toward digital and financial assets embedded in the system. Participation becomes a cultural expectation. Digital infrastructure accelerates normalization. As cash usage declines and digital payments dominate, physical assets appear increasingly inconvenient. Gold's independence becomes framed as inefficiency. Convenience replaces autonomy as the primary value. This shift matters. When convenience becomes synonymous with safety, assets that resist integration appear unsafe. Policy does not need to ban gold. It needs to make alternatives irresistible. The modern confiscation playbook relies on alignment rather than coercion. Alignment of incentives, alignment of narratives, alignment of institutions. Ownership slowly transforms into permission. Permission can be withdrawn. This transformation does not occur because governments seek control for its own sake. It occurs because systems under stress demand coordination. Independent assets disrupt coordination. Disruption threatens stability. In environments of high debt, fragile confidence, and geopolitical uncertainty, tolerance for disruption declines rapidly. Gold's role as an independent store of value becomes a liability rather than a hedge. The modern playbook does not eliminate gold, it contains it. Containment is more sustainable than prohibition. It preserves legitimacy while achieving control. By the time containment is complete, confiscation is unnecessary. Ownership has already been neutralized. This is the essence of modern financial governance. Outcomes are achieved without announcements. Power operates through structure. Gold confiscation, in this context, is not a single event. It is a process that unfolds quietly, legally, and incrementally. And once the process is complete, the distinction between ownership and access disappears. What remains is compliance. The transition from preparation to action rarely occurs without a catalyst. Modern systems are designed to tolerate inefficiency, dissent, and imbalance for extended periods. What they do not tolerate is loss of control. The triggers that activate restrictive measures are therefore not ideological, but functional. The first and most powerful trigger is fiscal stress. When sovereign financing becomes fragile, governments reassess all sources of potential leakage. Rising debt service costs, narrowing investor demand, or dependence on central bank intervention signal vulnerability. In such conditions, assets that enable capital to remain outside the funding ecosystem attract scrutiny. Gold does not finance deficits. It does not roll over debt. It does not support bond markets. During fiscal stress, this neutrality becomes a liability. Capital held in gold is capital not supporting state solvency. Inflation represents the second trigger. Persistent inflation erodes trust in monetary authority. When price stability becomes difficult to restore, governments prioritize narrative control. Assets that offer protection from inflation undermine that narrative. Gold becomes politically inconvenient. Inflation is particularly destabilizing when wages lag prices. Social pressure rises. Redistribution becomes unavoidable. Governments seek mechanisms to re-anchor expectations. Restricting alternatives to fiat credibility becomes attractive. The third trigger is currency instability. Exchange rate volatility, capital flight, or declining reserve adequacy expose the limits of monetary sovereignty. When confidence in the currency weakens, private gold accumulation accelerates. This acceleration is interpreted as a vote of no confidence. At that point, tolerance diminishes. Measures introduced as transparency or stability tools are expanded. Controls tighten. The objective is to prevent self-reinforcing exits. Geopolitical conflict represents another powerful trigger. Sanctions regimes, trade fragmentation, and security concerns normalize exceptional financial measures. Asset freezes and payment restrictions become routine. Once exceptional tools are normalized, their scope expands. Gold's independence becomes strategically problematic in this environment. Assets beyond reach complicate enforcement. Governments respond by extending jurisdictional control over physical and transactional infrastructure. Financial crises represent a composite trigger. Banking instability, liquidity freezes, or market dislocations compress decision timelines. Emergency powers are activated. Measures previously considered politically sensitive become feasible. Crises reduce resistance. Fear accelerates compliance. Legitimacy expands as urgency rises. What distinguishes the modern era is that crises need not be total to justify action. Partial stress is sufficient. The threshold for intervention is lowered. Systems intervene earlier to prevent escalation. This preemptive posture is central to modern governance. Waiting for collapse is considered failure. Acting early is framed as responsibility. Another trigger lies in demographic and political shifts. Aging populations strain fiscal systems. Pension obligations expand. Tax bases narrow. Governments seek to secure domestic savings. Assets held outside the system become politically salient. Gold, as a store of value, independent of pension frameworks and financial markets, represents unallocated wealth. In times of demographic pressure, unallocated wealth attracts policy attention. Technological shifts also act as triggers. The rollout of digital payment systems and programmable money creates new expectations of traceability and compliance. Assets that resist integration appear increasingly anomalous. As the financial system becomes more legible, illegibility becomes suspect. Importantly, none of these triggers require explicit hostility toward gold. They require only a convergence of stressors that elevate control over tolerance. Modern action rarely takes the form of outright bans. It takes the form of conditionality. Ownership remains legal under certain conditions. Those conditions narrow over time. During stress, conditions tighten quickly. Reporting requirements expand retroactively. Transaction approvals are delayed. Storage rules change. Export and transport restrictions appear. Each measure is justified independently. Cumulatively, they alter access. The final trigger is loss of narrative coherence. When official explanations no longer align with lived experience, alternative reference points gain traction. Gold serves as one such reference. Governments respond by reasserting narrative dominance. Control over alternatives becomes part of narrative restoration. This is where preparation pays off. Systems designed for incremental adjustment can escalate smoothly. No single decision appears radical. The public perceives continuity, not rupture. Resistance fragments. Legal challenges lag implementation. Institutional compliance ensures enforcement. The result is a shift from permissive ownership to managed ownership. Managed ownership is inherently unstable. It relies on ongoing justification. During prolonged stress, justification becomes permanent. History shows that once restrictions are normalized, reversal is rare. What begins as crisis response becomes baseline governance. This pattern applies broadly, not only to gold, but gold's unique characteristics place it at the intersection of monetary, fiscal, and political control. Gold becomes most vulnerable not during chaos, but during prolonged strain. Slow crises produce the most durable restrictions. This is the quiet repetition of history, not through dramatic seizures, but through sustained pressure that makes extraordinary measures feel ordinary. Gold confiscation does not return as spectacle. It returns as administration. The question is not whether governments intend to seize assets. The question is whether systems under pressure can tolerate assets they do not control. When tolerance ends, policy adapts. An adaptation, once justified, rarely retreats. That is why the modern playbook does not wait for collapse. It prepares for inevitability. And when conditions align, what was once unthinkable becomes procedural. Gold is tolerated only as long as it remains irrelevant. This is the final and most uncomfortable truth that emerges from historical precedent and modern financial architecture. Governments do not move against gold because it exists. They move against it when it matters. The critical threshold is not absolute ownership, but relative significance. As long as gold remains marginal within the broader financial system, it can coexist with fiat structures. Once it begins to function as a meaningful alternative, tolerance declines rapidly. This threshold is psychological before it is quantitative. Governments monitor not only volumes, but narratives. When gold is discussed as insurance, it is tolerated. When it is discussed as refuge, it is watched. When it is discussed as replacement, it becomes a problem. History shows that intervention follows perception. The moment gold shifts from hedge to signal, policy attention intensifies. Modern markets provide clearer visibility into this shift than ever before. Physical demand patterns, delivery stress, price behavior relative to real yields, and divergence from paper markets all serve as indicators. None of these need to be extreme. They need only to persist. Persistence signals intent. When households, institutions, or foreign actors accumulate gold steadily, rather than episodically, it suggests strategic repositioning. Strategic repositioning implies loss of confidence in future policy outcomes. That implication is destabilizing. The modern financial system is built on expectations of continuity. Debt sustainability assumes rolling confidence. Fiscal planning assumes predictable participation. Monetary policy assumes credibility. Gold accumulation challenges all three. The most dangerous scenario for governments is not panic buying, but calm accumulation. Panic can be addressed with liquidity and reassurance. Calm accumulation reflects deliberate choice. Deliberate choice is harder to reverse. This is why tolerance erodes quietly. Measures are introduced before the shift becomes obvious. Visibility is increased. Frictions are added. Alternatives are discouraged. The objective is to prevent gold from reaching systemic relevance. Gold also becomes problematic when it intersects with other stressors. Rising inflation, combined with negative real yields, increases its appeal. Currency weakness reinforces it. Geopolitical uncertainty amplifies it. These forces compound. When multiple stressors align, gold stops being a niche asset. It becomes a reference point. Reference points matter. When citizens measure stability through gold rather than currency, monetary authority weakens. Governments cannot allow parallel standards of trust to emerge. This is particularly true in highly indebted systems. Debt requires belief. Servicing debt indefinitely requires faith that future conditions will remain manageable. Gold represents doubt about that future. Modern governments are not hostile to doubt. They are hostile to collective doubt. Gold becomes dangerous when it aggregates doubt. Another critical condition is institutional participation. When pension funds, sovereign entities, or large financial institutions increase exposure to physical gold, the signal intensifies. Institutional behavior legitimizes alternatives. Legitimacy accelerates adoption. At that point, gold transitions from personal hedge to systemic indicator. Governments respond not to ideology, but to math. Capital allocated to gold is capital not allocated to debt instruments. In highly leveraged systems, marginal shifts matter. Yield curves react. Refinancing costs rise. Fiscal flexibility shrinks. This creates a feedback loop. Rising stress increases gold demand. Rising gold demand increases stress. Breaking this loop becomes a policy priority. This is where tolerance ends. Intervention does not require moral justification. It requires functional necessity. When gold accumulation threatens debt sustainability, policy adapts. Adaptation rarely announces itself as such. It appears as prudence, as modernization, as alignment with international standards. Gold is framed as outdated, as inefficient, as risky. Participation is discouraged socially as well as economically. The modern state does not need to seize gold to neutralize it. It needs only to reduce its relevance. Relevance is reduced through access restrictions, liquidity constraints, and narrative erosion. Gold becomes something that can be owned, but not easily used, held, but not leveraged, visible, but inconvenient. This condition satisfies policy objectives without provoking resistance. The final condition that ends tolerance is crisis overlap. When fiscal, monetary, and geopolitical stress coincide, patience disappears. Emergency frameworks activate. Measures introduced temporarily become permanent. History shows that rights constrained during emergencies rarely return fully. The justification fades. The restriction remains. Gold ownership becomes conditional on alignment with policy goals. Conditions evolve. Exceptions multiply. Enforcement tightens. What matters is not whether confiscation occurs, but whether gold can function as independent wealth under pressure. When it cannot, the outcome is effectively the same. Gold does not need to be seized to lose its protective function. It needs to be constrained enough that exit becomes unattractive. This is the modern endpoint. Gold is tolerated in good times because it does not matter. It becomes targeted in bad times because it does. The shift is not ideological. It is mechanical. Systems under stress seek cohesion. Independent assets fragment cohesion. Gold's strength for holders becomes its weakness within systems built on coordination. This is why gold confiscation is no longer unthinkable. Not because governments desire control, but because systems demand it. And when systems demand adaptation, policy follows. The final mistake observers make is assuming that future outcomes must resemble past events in form rather than function. History rarely repeats through identical actions. It repeats through identical constraints. When constraints converge, systems respond in predictable ways, even if the mechanisms differ. Gold confiscation in the modern era does not require trucks, vault raids, or public decrees. It requires only that gold cease to function as an effective alternative at the moment it is most needed. Control over function matters more than control over possession. This distinction defines modern outcomes. Ownership without utility is tolerated. Utility without control is not. Modern systems are exceptionally skilled at separating the two. Gold's utility depends on liquidity, mobility, and discretion. Each of these can be constrained independently. Liquidity can be reduced through market regulation and transaction scrutiny. Mobility can be restricted through transport rules, export controls, and jurisdictional oversight. Discretion can be eliminated through reporting, disclosure, and surveillance. None of these actions require confiscation. Together, they achieve the same result. When gold can be owned but not easily sold, moved, or converted without scrutiny, its role as an escape valve weakens. At that point, gold becomes symbolic rather than functional. Symbolic assets do not threaten systems. This is the modern equilibrium. Governments do not need to eliminate gold. They need to neutralize it during periods of stress. Neutralization preserves legitimacy while protecting control. Legitimacy is critical. Modern governance depends on perceived continuity. Abrupt actions undermine trust. Gradual constraint preserves it. This is why modern interventions are framed as technical adjustments rather than political decisions. Language matters. Words like stability, transparency, alignment, and modernization replace words like restriction or seizure. The public does not react to technical language. Resistance requires clarity. Ambiguity disarms opposition. Another crucial factor is global coordination. Unlike past eras, modern financial systems are deeply interconnected. Regulatory standards converge across jurisdictions. Measures introduced in one region are mirrored elsewhere under the banner of harmonization. This convergence reduces arbitrage. Capital has fewer places to hide. Gold, once portable across borders, encounters synchronized constraints. Global coordination does not require explicit agreement. It emerges through shared incentives. Highly indebted states face similar pressures. Similar pressures produce similar responses. The narrative reinforces this convergence. Gold ownership is increasingly framed as speculative, environmentally damaging, or inefficient. Younger generations are encouraged toward digital assets embedded within regulated frameworks. Cultural legitimacy shifts. Over time, gold becomes culturally marginal, even if legally permitted. Marginal assets attract less political defense. Less defense makes further restriction easier. This cultural dimension is often overlooked. Confiscation becomes unnecessary when relevance declines. Yet relevance does not disappear spontaneously. It is managed. The final stage of the modern playbook is normalization. Once restrictions are embedded and participation has adapted, the system stabilizes around the new equilibrium. What was once exceptional becomes routine. At that point, reversing restrictions appears unnecessary or even dangerous. Stability becomes a justification for permanence. History confirms this pattern repeatedly. Emergency measures rarely vanish. They evolve into baseline governance. The crisis that justified them fades. The controls remain. Gold's vulnerability lies not in its legality, but in its incompatibility with systems built on continuous refinancing, monetary flexibility, and narrative cohesion. As long as global systems rely on expanding debt and managed confidence, independent stores of value will remain problematic. This does not imply inevitability in the dramatic sense. It implies predictability in the structural sense. Gold confiscation is no longer unthinkable because the word confiscation no longer applies. The function has changed. The outcome has not. What matters is not whether gold is taken. What matters is whether it can protect when protection is most needed. If gold cannot move freely, cannot be exchanged discreetly, cannot function without permission, then ownership becomes ceremonial. Ceremonial ownership does not threaten systems. Functional independence does. Modern systems are designed to tolerate ceremony. They do not tolerate exits. This is the quiet repetition of history, not through force, not through announcements, but through structure. Gold once represented absolute independence. Today, independence is conditional. When conditions tighten, conditions can be withdrawn. That is the modern lesson. Gold confiscation does not return as an event. It returns as a boundary defining how much independence a system can tolerate before cohesion becomes more important than choice. And when cohesion is threatened, policy does not hesitate. It adapts. Quietly. Gold does not threaten governments in good times. It threatens them when trust becomes fragile. Confiscation does not return as force. It returns as structure, as regulation, as permission. History is not repeating loudly. It is repeating efficiently. Understanding this is not about fear. It is about recognizing how modern systems adapt under pressure. Because the most important financial shifts are not announced when they happen. They are already in place by the time most people realize the rules have changed. If you want to understand how power, money, and ownership are quietly evolving, stay with Shadow Rewind. Because in the modern economy, what matters most is not what you are allowed to own, it is when, how, and under what conditions you are allowed to keep it.